Are you looking at my soul? You want a Tic Tac? So he says, you know you have one eye set a little bit higher than your other eye? No. I did not. He goes, it doesn't affect your vision or anything. I just thought you might want to be self-conscious for the rest of your life. I went out to my car mirror. Am I some kind of monster? Is that a hump? I am not an animal. I am a man. What's the matter with him? Then he asked me, would you like to try trifocals? And I'm like, I must have been away a while because I have no idea what you're talking about. He says it's exactly what you would think. You can see at 3 different distances depending on where you look through your lens. You can see close, medium, or far away. And I'm like, I can't even imagine getting used to that. There's a book, there's a plane, there's Alpha Centauri!
Good morning. It's Sunday. Thank God it's Sunday, September the 24th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have rules for Patriots, rules for Retrogrades, no free lunch, the rape of the mind, and bishop-barron. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you. And now, There's No Free Lunch, 250 Economic Truths by David-Bahnsen.
Corporations should be subject to the rules of open competition without exception, rules that will turn their self-interest towards more constructive paths. Otherwise, both the efficiency of the market and the public's confidence in the fairness and legitimacy of the system will be dangerously undercut. Capitalism is a fundamentally populist enterprise governed in the interest of the mass of consumers, and it depends upon a clear separation between government and business. If that line is blurred, many of the benefits of the system, both economic and moral, are badly undermined. Yuval Levin. This dual danger is important. Cronyism is a moral iniquity, rewarding the rich and powerful over the less favored and entrenched. It violates the entire ethic of biblical exhortations and allows some to throw the baby out with the bathwater. The vast majority of criticisms I have heard of free market systems were, in fact, criticisms of cronyism that shot too far and too wide. We must protect the morality and economic cogency of free enterprise from such frustrated attacks.
And that was There's No Free Lunch by David-Bahnsen. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, The Rape of the Mind.
The liberation from magic thinking. In our Western civilization, the growth of the mass media of communication has increased the influence of collective pressure on both our prejudices and our unbiased thinking. We live in a world of constant noise, which captures our minds even when we are not aware of it. Already, we have in our society the problem of the lonely, unheard voices. I am convinced that there are many wise men among us whose voices and learning would help us to correct that part of our thinking which is delusional. But their wise words are shouted down by an excess of noise from elsewhere. In our society, a man cannot simply communicate his wisdom and insight anymore. In order to be heard, he has to advertise and fortify it with mega-cyclic power and official labels. An organization must stand behind him and must make sure that he will be rightly timed so that there will be listeners to receive his message. He must have an acknowledged label and an official diploma, otherwise his voice is lost. To correct mass delusion is one of the most difficult tasks of democracy. Democracy pleads for freedom of thought, and this means that it demands the right of all men to test all forms of collective emotion and collective thinking. This testing is possible only if constant personal and collective self-criticism is encouraged. Democracy must face this task of preserving mobility of thought in order to free itself from blind fears and magic. The clash and mutual impact of a variety of opinions, which are characteristic of democracy, may not directly produce truth, but they prepare the way. At this very moment, the whole world dances around a delusion, around the magic idea that the material and military power behind an argument will bring us nearer to the truth and nearer to safety. Yet, one push of the bottom and the atomic missiles may lead us all to mutual suicide. In a world of warring and contrasting thoughts and delusions, the solution lies in the delineation of frontiers, of awareness, of mutual limits. This agreement on what it is we disagree about is the first step to understanding.
And that was The Liberation from Magic Thinking from The Rape of the Mind by Joost-Meerlo, M.D. Back in a minute.
Feel my way through the travel the world, but I don't have any plans. Wish that I could stay forever this young, not afraid to close my eyes. Life's a game made for everyone, and love is the prize. So wake me up when it's all over, when I'm wiser and I'm older. All this time I was finding myself, and I didn't know I was lost. So wake me up when it's all over, wake me up when I'm wiser and I'm older. All this time I was finding myself, and I didn't know I was lost. Didn't know I was lost. Wake me up when it's over. Didn't know when I'm wiser. Didn't know I was lost. Didn't know. So wake me up when it's over. I'm wiser and I'm older. All this time I was finding myself, and I didn't know I was lost. So wake me up when it's all over, when I'm wiser and I'm older. All this time I was finding myself, and I didn't know I was lost.
Thank you. And now, rules for retrogrades. 40 tactics to defeat the radical left.
Rule 26. The retrograde must use Saul Alinsky's shrewdest, trickiest rules for radicals against the radicals themselves. We will examine how to specifically reverse two of his rules, 4 and 13. Respectively, these two rules read: make the enemy live up to his own book of rules, and pick the target, freeze it, personalize it, and polarize it. First, let's polarize Alinsky's Rule 4. Make the enemy live up to his own book of rules. Alinsky admits openly that he was inspired, naturally or supernaturally, by the tactics of the devil, who simply cherishes the contempt of hypocrisy. According to both scripture and tradition, Lucifer was and is fascinated by both the concept and the implementation of hypocrisy, employing it wherever opportune on his own behalf and pointing it out in others whenever expedient, which of course indicates his implementation of a sort of meta-hypocrisy, a hypocrisy within hypocrisy. No surprise, then, that Alinsky's favorite tactic involved decrying hypocrisy and anything else looking like hypocrisy in his political opponents. Every American general election cycle, radicals across the land furiously forage the political landscape for any and all indicia of the slightest instance of hypocrisy by the religious right, which they find, of course, since all humans make mistakes. What's truly diabolic in this modus operandi is the startling consequence that Americans have generally given purchase to the radical lie that an act of hypocrisy by Party A equates to an automatic score for his rival, Party B. Naturally, the consequence of unintelligent voter behavior continues to incentivize radicals to weaponize hypocrisy. We must turn the tide by making radicals meet muster, a double twist to be sure. In other words, force the enemy to live up to his own rules, about enemies living up to their own rules. In order to accomplish this, Christians must become more adept at weaponizing the radical concept of equality. Radical impunity against Christians, in the name of equality, violates justice. Retrogrades must resolve this abuse of so-called equality for themselves. For example, consider the radical community organizing effort from 2012 until 2017 that resulted in the temporary coercion of Christian bakers in Colorado to produce cakes for celebrants of homosexual civil unions, until the Court of Appeals holding was overturned in the Supreme Court in 2018 in favor of the bakeries. Supposedly value-neutral jurisprudence in America, such as the decidedly anti-Christian holding by the Court of Appeals, has never actually been neutral, notwithstanding its claims. Without other opinions, the retrograde must negate the enemy's legal tactics culturally. He must do this by showing that, one way or another, an immoral application of one of the rules for radicals against a Christian can easily be weaponized by that same Christian. In the absence of an eventual overturn by the Supreme Court, Christian bakers might have ironically employed Alinsky's Rule 4 by posting signs in their bakeries saying, "All profits from wedding cakes for homosexual civil unions will be diverted exclusively to heteronormative religious causes." This would classify as a defensive tactic, as it rebuffs prospectively against enforceable requests by homosexuals for wedding cakes. Sure enough, between 2012 and 2017, Christian cake shops might have been legally required to violate their Christian scruples, but this way, at least they could use the profits to strike against the very occasion of the radicals' oppression. More importantly, their signs would likely have deterred homosexuals from requesting, i.e. requiring, them to provide such cakes. The radical insistence on a certain type of equality under the law would, in that case, work in favor of Christians for once. The Christian baker would have successfully reversed Alinsky's Rule 4, even in the face of legal defeat. Alinsky's Rule 13, being offensive rather than defensive, allows for a more aggressive response to the same circumstances. Pick the target, freeze it, personalize it, and polarize it. Operating on the basis of Rule 13 from 2012 until 2017, the retrograde might have struck back, locating and then patronizing bakeries run by radical anti-Christian homosexualists and forcibly requesting Christian and heteronormative-themed wedding cakes. This would be the retrograde's more ambitious way of affirming the exclusivity of man-woman marriages. Pick the target, i.e. an opposition bakery, personalize the message, and polarize what they attempted to do to Christians. The radical left won't live and let live, so why should we? Forcible viewpoint discrimination in the realm of baker harassment cuts both ways, after all. The retrograde must see to it that it does. While the Supreme Court eventually rendered the issue moot in 2018, the hot-button issue of Christian bakeries and homosexual wedding cakes provided an excellent opportunity to exercise the retrograde's moral imagination. It will prove both necessary and worthwhile to anticipate what retrogrades may do, defensively and offensively, in a foreseeable day to come, when the ultimate holding may not be as innocuous to Christians as that rendered by Masterpiece Cake Shop versus Colorado Civil Rights Commission 2018. In practice, abiding this rule of Alinsky's 13 serves to cross-reference the rule for retrogrades enjoying a perennial offensive counterattack. The reader can plainly see how much more effective the offensive application of Alinsky's rules are than the defensive. Once more, always be on offense.
And that was Rule 26 from Rules for Retrogrades by Timothy and David Gordon. Back in a minute.
It's been a long day without you, my friend, and I'll tell you all about it when I see you again. We've come a long way from where we began. Oh, I'll tell you all about it when I see you again. When I see you again.
start another path. I know we'd love to hit the road and laugh, but something told me that it wouldn't last. Had to switch up, look at things different, see the bigger picture. Those were the days, hard work forever pays.
Now I see you in a better place.
See you in a better place.
How could we not talk about family when family's all that we got? Everything I went through, you were standing there by my side, and now you could be with me for the last ride.
It's been a long day without you, my friend, and I'll tell you all about it when I see you again. We've come a long way from where we began. Oh, I'll tell you all about it when I see you again. When I see you again.
We should both go watch your way, and the vibe is feeling stronger. What's small turn to a friendship, and friendship turn to a bond, and the bond will never be broken, and love will never get lost. And when brotherhood comes, the line will never be crossed. Established it on our own when that line had to be drawn, and that line is what we reach. So remember me when I'm gone.
When I'm gone,
When I'm gone.
How could we not talk about family when family's all that we got? Everything I went through, you were standing there by my side, and now you could be with me for the last time.
Let the light guide your way. Yeah. Hold every memory as you go. And every road you take will always lead you home.
Thank you. And now, Rules for Patriots, How Conservatives Can Win Again by Steve-Deace.
Chapter 3, Commandment number 2, Never attack what you're not willing to kill. If you're going to win in politics, you have to know what politics actually is. Most of us believe politics is simply how we advance public policy in America, or cynically define it the way Obi-Wan Kenobi once defined the Mos Eisley spaceport in the original Star Wars. You will never find a more wretched hive of scum and villainy. Now, those may be examples of what politics does or what politics becomes, but that's not what politics is. Politics is primarily two things. First, politics is faith and ethics in action. A study done by a University of Virginia psychologist said Americans today are the most politically polarized we've been in our history. And the primary reason for the polarization is a difference in morality. But what determines our morality? Our faith and our ethics. We are all, whether we prefer to recognize it or not, created in the image of the living God. From that common origin comes similarities in our design despite differing ancestries. For instance, all human beings, unless they've had a complete psychological break and become psychopaths, work through the same philosophical paradigm when making any moral decision. It begins with a faith/authority statement. In other words, the first thing we process is who or what we believe we are ultimately accountable to at this time, and or the most in need of pleasing. That determination will dictate a belief system, whereas we create an ideology to satisfy the faith/authority statement. That belief system will determine our convictions, i.e., behaviors, emotions, responses, thoughts, etc., which are the actions we take in order to please and or honor who or what we originally decided we either needed to please and or be held accountable to. This is why people say things like actions speak louder than words, because how you act is what demonstrates to people whom or what you ultimately serve. A famous line in the Bible puts it thusly: "Show me your faith apart from your works, and I will show you my faith by my works." When asked by his followers, how will we know who is and isn't really one of us? Jesus didn't say, by their ability to clearly and consistently articulate a systematic theology you will know them. No. Rather, Jesus said, by their fruit you will know them. The fruit in question here is the kind that blossoms after a seed has been planted, grown deep roots, and then becomes a fully developed tree or crop. Now, someone may claim rather convincingly they intend to have an apple orchard, but if they plant a bunch of oranges instead, they end up with a grove. Likewise, someone can claim to be a conservative, a Christian, a constitutionalist, loving father, husband, etc., all they want. But for others to believe that is true means there needs to be fruit or works that are indicative of what is expected from someone claiming to be any or all of those things. This is why politicians who try to have it both ways, by saying things like, I'm personally pro-life, but I can't impose my private religious beliefs on others, are lying, phony hypocrites at best, or schizophrenics at worst. If someone really believed that all human life comes from the Creator and is therefore sacred, they would do everything within their grasp to defend it, short of succumbing to the tactics that make them exactly like what they claim to be against. Men, imagine if you came home and told your wife you were, quote, personally pro-faithfulness, but you can't impose your private religious beliefs on other women who might be attracted to you. The next call you'd need to make would either be your lawyer or a Kevlar distributor. So let's apply this philosophical paradigm to politics. When a politician or candidate is faced with a moral dilemma, the first thing she will do is determine who or what am I ultimately accountable to. This is a faith, or sometimes lack thereof, statement. Am I ultimately accountable to my sworn oath of office? When I said, so help me God, who is that God? And what does he, she, it demand of me? Is it my own conscience I'm accountable to? Well, what informs my conscience, and how do I know it should? Is it my constituents? Do I do what my constituents want me to do, even if I think it is wrong? If there's a conflict between my conscience and the desires of my constituents, how do I decide which comes first, and how do I know which is right? Do I please the voters at all costs? Is it the Constitution? How do I know my interpretation of the Constitution is correct? Then, how do I know the standard I chose to determine my interpretation of the Constitution is the right one? Is it popular opinion like polls or the media pundits? However he or she answers these questions will determine the belief system they will program into their subconscious to begin carrying out whatever eventual convictions, or lack thereof, they believe will get the approval of whom or what they're most trying to please. So from now on, when you hear a politician or candidate say they can separate their private religious beliefs from their public governance, realize that's because their private religious beliefs are really either non-existent or a steaming pile of horse pucky. Otherwise, they'd be driving their public convictions. What they act upon is what they really believe, because what they really believe is what drives them to do whatever it is they do or don't. And that's the same for you, me, your spouse, your children, your parents, your friends, and your boss, and for every other created being in all walks of life everywhere and at all times, unless they've suffered some sort of psychotic break. Along the same lines, many of our politicians/candidates fall into the trap of, will I do something, as opposed to asking themselves, can I do something? Human nature is not basically good. Therefore, when we rely on our will, we are playing Russian roulette with our ethics. For example, suppose I am locked in a room with an attractive, naked, and willing woman. At first, I may not succumb to the temptation, but the more and more I ask myself, will I cheat on my wife in this sort of situation, the more likely I eventually will. Many of the people we elect are facing a similar and daily den of iniquity once they're in public office. And the more they rely on their own will, the more their resolve will wear down, and they will compromise, rationalize, or just surrender. However, if I put myself in that same situation with that same attractive, naked, and willing woman, but then ask myself, can I cheat on my wife instead? Now the entire conversation within my conscience has changed, because can is a word that denotes permission. Do I have permission to disappoint my children in such a way? Do I have permission to betray my wife and everyone that counts on me? Do I have permission to break God's commandment against adultery? Think I'm naive? Think again. How many times have you gotten angry at a fellow driver's incompetence or rudeness on the road, and thought about running him down and letting him have it? So why don't you do it? Because your conscience pricks you by asking you, can you do that? That compels you to then count the cost of this action. You could put others in the car with you that care about you in danger. You could make yourself late for wherever you have to go next. You could do something that will cause you to be arrested and go to jail. In other words, by asking yourself, can I run this guy down? You have begun considering the consequences of your actions. If you ask yourself, will I run this guy down? You begin considering all the ways you would like to, thus feeding the desires of your fallen base nature and increasing the likelihood you will do some dangerous and or dumb things. Imagine if our politicians asked themselves, can I violate my oath of office, as opposed to, will I violate my oath of office? Or can I go back on my word, as opposed to, will I go back on my word? Many times I have been asked to do things that compromise my integrity. And sometimes these are things I would like to do if it were up to me alone. But it's not. I am eternally accountable to my Creator, who redeemed me at the high cost of his own Son. I am accountable to my wife, whom I made a lifelong commitment to. I am accountable to my children, who need me to set a good example for them at the risk of making a mistake that could cost the generations that follow. I am accountable to my employees and business partners who are banking on my integrity as part of my on-air persona. I am accountable to my audience who needs to trust that what they're hearing coming over the radio each broadcast day is sincere. Thus, when these temptations come my way, I respond, I can't do it, and not, I won't do it. It's nothing personal. You're just asking me to do something I can't do. I have a defined boundary here, and I can no more violate that boundary than I can violate the boundary in my neighbor's yard and start treating it as my own. This is why I will often ask those running for office, what can't you do? The 10 Commandments God gave to Moses mainly consist of statements telling us what not to do. Thus, if we're going to honor the oath we swear to that same God, we ought to have a pretty good idea of what we can't do as well. Now that we've established the why and how, politics is first and foremost faith and ethics in action, let's move on to the second thing politics is, how we conduct civil war in this country. When we, conservatives, Christians, constitutionalists, libertarians, all those that make up the right of center coalition in this country, view politics as a simple debate over public policy and not how we conduct civil war in this country, we will lose every time. The other side understands this, which is why they ruthlessly pursue their agenda and worldview with far less concern for public opinion than we do. We, on the other hand, want to debate, vent, wring our hands, or worse, nice the system to death. I especially see this among many of the Christian political circles I run in as a fellow Jesus freak. We're sending chaplains off to war when we should be sending soldiers trained to win the peace. The Bible says blessed are the peacemakers, but it doesn't say blessed are the peace lovers. Jesus himself said he came not to bring peace, but a sword. After all, is there a message more confrontational and offensive in all of human history than the gospel, which says you're evil, you crave and desire sin, and you wouldn't do what's right unless there was something in it for you. You deserve hell for breaking God's commandments, and it is hell you will receive unless you accept through faith the grace that is offered through the exclusive truth of the redemptive work of Jesus Christ. Now, if someone can think of a nice way to tell every human being that has ever lived what I just said, by all means, clue me in, because as someone that communicates for a living, I haven't discovered it yet. That might be why they hung Jesus on a cross and killed all of his apostles except one, whom they tried to kill by boiling him in oil, but he survived. America's largest Christian church and its nicest and most well-known pastor, Joel Osteen, are in Houston, Texas. Joel smiles a lot. Okay, he smiles an awful lot, like perpetually. It's kind of creepy, really, but hey, he's helping Americans find their best life now, so who am I to judge, right? But here's a question. If he and his church that is so large they have to meet in the basketball arena the NBA's Houston Rockets used to play in, were really preaching the full truth of the Bible, would their city have elected their first lesbian mayor in 2009? In fact, Osteen provided the prayer of blessing for the new lesbian mayor at her swearing-in ceremony. There is no biblical precedent in either the Old or New Testaments for a man of God enabling and validating that which God says is wrong so publicly. Jesus ate with sinners, but he died for their sins so they could be redeemed from their sinfulness, not blessed in it. If it's true the black-robed regiment of pastors preaching freedom and liberty from America's pulpits were instrumental in our victory in the war for independence, then it must also be true that too many of our pastors and pulpits are to blame for America's current nosedive towards Gomorrah and socialism by preaching watered-down self-esteem psychobabble.
And that was Chapter 3 of Rules for Patriots, How Conservatives Can Win Again by Steve-Deace. Back in a minute.
I've been reading books of old, the legends and the myths, Achilles and his gold, Hercules and his gifts, Spider-Man's control, and Batman with his fists. And clearly I don't see myself upon that list. So she said, where'd you wanna go? How much you wanna risk? I'm not looking for somebody with some superhuman gifts, some superhero, some fairy tale bliss. Just something I can turn to, somebody I can kiss. I want something just like this. I've been reading books of old, the legends and the myths, the testaments they told, the moon and its eclipse. And Superman rolls a suit before he lifts. But I'm not the kind of person that it fits. So she said, where'd you wanna go? How much you wanna risk? I'm not looking for somebody with some superhuman gifts, some superhero, some fairy tale bliss. Just something I can turn to, somebody I can miss. I want something just like this. Oh, I want something just like this. Oh, I want something just like this. I want something just like this. Oh, I want something just like this.
Thank you. And now, Bishop Robert Barron.
Peace be with you. You know, the parable that's at the heart of our gospel today from Matthew 20 is one that I love because based on 37 years of preaching, it's one of those passages in the New Testament that really bothers people. I could pick out a handful, like 4 or 5. The Martha Mary story is another one. But this is one that over all the years I've been preaching, more people come up to me and say, you know, Father or Bishop, I don't get that parable, or it really bothers me. How could this be right? I don't know what Jesus is talking about here. Well, see, I love that because it proves something very interesting, that the parable itself is doing its spiritual work. What I mean is, it's not just conveying correct information about God. So some parables, they teach us truths about God, and that's great. But other ones, they kind of reach into our souls. They bug us because it's a bit like a surgeon, I suppose, doing exploratory surgery. That in this process, he uncovers difficulties in the body. Well, this kind of parable is like that in regard to the soul. It unmasks, or it sheds light upon certain darknesses in our soul, certain resistances to God. So it's very interesting and important to follow our resistance here. Where's that coming from? How come I don't like this parable? How come this parable bugs me? Well, you know what I'm talking about now. This parable about the kingdom of heaven being like a landowner who went out and hired workers for his vineyard first thing in the morning. And he said, I'll pay you the daily wage. They said, great. And so they work all day in the hot sun. Others, he goes out at noon, hires them, same deal. Others at 3. And then finally, at the very end of the day, he hires workers. And then the time comes for payment. And those hired at the very end of the day, who worked for only an hour, get the daily wage. So naturally, the ones hired earlier think, hey, this is great. I'll be getting more. But they get the same wage as those hired at 5. And even those who were hired at 9, worked all day in the hot sun, they get the same thing. And they squawk. Well, this is unfair. It's unjust. these people work for 1 hour. I work for 8 hours. Why are we getting paid the same? Well, of course, everyone sees the connection to the spiritual life. Let's say you've been at it your whole life long, honoring God and doing what you're told to do and trying to be a good person and following the commands of the church. And suppose there's somebody who, at the very end of life, after living a terrible life of dissolution or violence, deep sin, at the very end, repents. Is that right, that they get the same reward as you would get? You both get to heaven? Remember hearing this story from an older priest friend of mine. This goes back to like the 1930s or 40s. And there was a notorious gangland hitman in Chicago. I mean, one of the worst people you can imagine. Someone whose whole life is dedicated to killing people. And he was involved in some kind of shootout, and he's lying in the street, dying. He was a Catholic, though, and he had the presence of mind to ask for a priest to come, and the priest came. And with his dying breaths, this man confessed his sins and then died. And the priest was asked about it, and he said, well, yeah, I'm sure he'll require purgatory. But yes, this man will go to heaven, just as St. Francis of Assisi went to heaven. And evidently, this older priest friend told me, it caused a real furor in the press. People writing letters in, complaining. How could this be true? That this hitman, this terrible person, just with one simple confession, he'll get the same heaven that St. Francis gets? Doesn't seem right. Doesn't seem fair or just. I'll give you an example from the scriptures. How about the good thief, Dismas? In fact, we call him Saint Dismas, don't we? We don't know anything about him, but his life ends on a Roman cross, accused of thievery. So, I mean, we're not talking about Mother Teresa here, right? We're talking about someone probably lived a kind of wicked life. But at the very end, he reaches out to Jesus. And what's he hear? Today, you will be with me in paradise. Well, again, imagine someone who they've been Catholic all their life. They've gone through all kinds of struggles and temptations, but they've hung in there and they've done the Lord's work and they've tried to be good and just and loving and they struggled and they made it through. And they get the same reward as that guy, as Dismas, in fact, of Saint Dismas. It just doesn't seem fair. It doesn't seem just. Now, at this point, this is where the scalpel, is cutting. This is where the light is shining. This resistance needs to be looked at. And let me do so now under two different rubrics. St. Catherine of Siena said this: because Jesus said that he himself is the way, then the way to heaven is itself heaven. Now, let me say that again. Jesus said, I'm the truth and the life, right? But he also said, I'm the way. And that means the way to heaven is itself heaven. See, here's a false way to think about things spiritually. Heaven, it's this great candy land. It's this great reward. It's this great prize that I get. After what? After this terrible, tough slog through life. I'm asked to do, God knoweth why, but I'm asked to do all these really challenging, difficult things. To pray, to sacrifice, to love, yes, even my enemies. I've tried, and it's just a tough slog. And there's no letting up. It's supposed to go on your whole life long. So I guess, after I paid that terrible price, then I deserve this reward at the end. I deserve the prize of heaven. And someone, therefore, who hasn't done the work, he hasn't gone through the long slog. He's lived this kind of, self-indulgent life, and maybe at the very end, he does the right thing. He gets the same reward I get. Come on. Remember, Catherine of Siena. The way to heaven is heaven. Let me put it this way. do you really think that Mother Teresa of Calcutta, now in heaven, confronted there with someone in need, offered there the opportunity to love, would say, nah, I'm done with that. I did that all my life long on earth. I put up with all these people, all my life long, and now I deserve a little R&R. I deserve my nice reward here in heaven. No. The point is, the way to heaven is heaven. Meaning, the love that she was demonstrating all her life long is precisely what was preparing her for the fullness of life in heaven. I worked in the hot sun all day. Rather, I was given the enormous privilege of participating in the divine life all my life long. And maybe Dismas, the good thief, or that mob hitman, they didn't have that grace. They didn't have that opportunity. This is not some drudgery that we're forced to go through in order to get some reward. But rather, we must see the path of love as itself already an anticipation of heaven. Do you see how the resentment we feel is a sign that we haven't yet got this right, that we haven't thought this through? If you're wearing your religious obligation like a terrible albatross around your neck, then you haven't gotten it yet. Think about this. Let me turn that Mother Teresa image around. Suppose somebody who's a great sinner is suddenly sent to Mother Teresa's mother house in Calcutta and told, I want you to live the life of the sisters for the next year. He's completely unused to it. Has been a self-indulgent person, never engaged in the works of love. And now here he is in the worst slum in the world, caring for the poorest of the poor. He'd say, I've just landed in hell. But now imagine in time, as he gives himself to that life, as he surrenders to it, and he realizes, this is the life of love that I've been called to. Without changing his address, he'd go from hell to heaven. See, when you're saying, I've labored in the hot sun all day, well, then you're still in the hell of your own self-regard. So let the uneasiness you feel upon hearing this work its way in your soul. And now here's the second observation I want to make. If heaven is the life of love, and that's how all the great spiritual masters would say it, right? There are three things that last: faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these is love. That's because in heaven, faith will fade away. I mean, I'll see God face to face. I don't need faith. Hope will fade away because I've realized my goal. But love remains because love is what heaven is. Heaven is the place of perfect love. Love is willing the good of the other, right? Okay, go back to this parable. You mean that guy who worked for 1 hour is getting the same reward I'm getting? It's ridiculous. I worked all day in the hot sun. I should get 8 times what he got. What's on display in that attitude? An extraordinary lack of love. To love is to will the good of the other. Notice, please, if you find this in the letter of James, our great tradition has nothing at all against justice, but mercy or love trumps justice. It goes beyond justice. If we're caught in a pure justice frame of mind, then we haven't moved to the level of true love, willing the good of the other. Now, move into that space. And so you've labored all day. Yeah, hey, I've been given the opportunity to love all my life long. But someone who hadn't been given that opportunity, someone who at the very end, the mob hitman, but he gets in. Well, if your heart is filled with willing the good of the other, what's your attitude? Great. Terrific. I'm delighted. Hey, wait a minute, it's not fair. I'm kind of beyond this preoccupation with fair and unfair. All I want is what's good for the other. And this is, look, he gets into heaven. He gets to share the life of God. Beautiful. Beautiful. I rejoice in that. And what love has done is it's burned away any preoccupation with, well, who deserves it more and who's worked harder. And that's burned away. See, let this parable, everybody, shine its light upon the darkness in us, which just means an absence of love. Let our very resistance to it be a spiritual lesson. It's functioning, I've been in spiritual direction since I was a kid in the seminary. A bad spiritual director just says yes to you all the time, says you're doing great, nothing wrong with you, everything's fine. A good spiritual director shines light in dark places, turns things over to reveal truths that maybe we don't want revealed. This parable functions as a good spiritual director. If it bothers you, good. It's meant to shine light on some lack of love. And God bless you.
And that was Bishop-Barron. Back in a minute.
Of the program with the discussion as it has unfolded. Thank the Lord, Rush Limbaugh's on by the Rush Hawkins Singers is exactly what's called for. Rush Limbaugh's on.
Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States. Today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you to be honest, smart, and beautiful, and remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.